Alrighty, hi folks. It looks like we are officially live. Hello everyone, and welcome to this program this morning. Or I should say this morning in Santa Cruz, California. It could be afternoon or even evening wherever you're tuning in from. But it is 11 o'clock on the dot over here in Santa Cruz, California, but we'll give folks just another minute or two to get settled into today's chat and get excited for today's program. And as we're waiting for folks to tune in, please go ahead and say hi in the YouTube live chat. Go ahead and introduce yourself, say where you're watching from. We love to see where Seymour Center supporters are at in the world. All right, excellent. Hi, everyone. It's so great to see everyone getting settled into today's program. We'll get started in just about 30 seconds or so, giving folks the opportunity to get settled in here. All right, excellent. So it looks like folks are joining us, which is great, but we really do not have a minute to spare. We have a wonderful program lined up for you all. So let's go ahead and dive in and get started. So officially, welcome everyone. We're so happy that you're here. Welcome to another Labside Chat with the Seymour Marine Discovery Center. My name is Jen and I will be your host today. If you have watched a Labside Chat before, welcome back. If this is your first time tuning in, we are so happy that you're here. Today's program is an opportunity to have a Q&A style discussion with a scientist from UC Santa Cruz, and we'll be talking about how scientific research plays a role in the conservation and understanding of the world's oceans. And you have all tuned in for the ultimate chat today, because we are talking with and have the honor of asking questions to Dr. Jerome Fiechter. Dr. Jerome Fiechter is an ecosystem oceanographer and an assistant professor of ocean sciences at UC Santa Cruz, and is doing some really, really cool research in the ocean and figuring out how different biological, chemical, physical processes can affect everything in the ocean, from the tiniest of organisms to really big predators. So Jerome, thank you so much for being here today.
You're welcome. Happy to be here. Good morning, Jen, and good morning, everyone online. Or good afternoon or good evening.
Yeah, exactly, right? People could be tuning in from all over the world here. So Jerome, again, I'm so excited that you're here, and really everybody watching at home is excited that you're here too, because I got so many questions to ask you, and I'm so excited to dive into all of those. They're all over the map, and they're going to be really, really important to really learn more about your work and what you do. But before we dive into those questions that I got, I also want to note and let everyone watching at home know that if you did not submit a question in advance for Jerome, not to worry. You can always go ahead and submit your questions in the live chat on YouTube's live chat feature, and we'll be able to answer those as well. Alrighty, so Jerome, are you ready? It's like a rapid fire round of questions.
As ready as I'll be, I guess.
Definitely. So I mentioned earlier that you are an ecosystem oceanographer. You study all different types of processes in the ocean. And this might be a silly question, but just to make sure I'm on the same page as you, when I say processes, biological, chemical, physical processes, what is that? What does that mean?
It's a good question. I mean, it's looking at what in the ocean shapes the response of an ecosystem. And, by training, I'm a physical oceanographer, but I very quickly realized that the physics was a lot more interesting if it was connected to the biology and the chemistry that happens in the ocean. And if I can start from just a very simple, basic explanation, the difference between a marine and a terrestrial ecosystem is that in terrestrial ecosystem, if you have a plant or a tree that dies and falls to the ground and decays into new nutrients, those nutrients are available right there where the tree or the plant fell. In the ocean, it's very different. If you have an organism that dies and decays, in the process, it sinks to the bottom of the ocean. So essentially, that process of regenerating nutrients from dead phytoplankton or zooplankton brings all those nutrients to the bottom of the ocean where there is no light. So there's no possibility to do photosynthesis again to create new phytoplankton. So in that sense, without ocean currents and without movement of water masses that brings those deep nutrients back towards the surface where there is enough sunlight for photosynthesis to happen, the ocean would essentially be a biological desert. Because all those nutrients are sinking down. So what I'm mostly interested is to look at, the regions, the coastal regions in the ocean, especially off of California and the west coast of the US, where the ocean currents are such that they're bringing those nutrients back up towards the surface, which then fuels the entire marine food web.
Yeah, and bringing those nutrients up from the bottom of the ocean up to the surface, is that called upwelling?
That is exactly right. So one way you can refer to this is by the term upwelling, which means essentially bringing deep water up towards the surface of the ocean. And we know that those deep water are usually, well, first they're pretty cold, but they also contain a lot of nutrients. And, if you've gone swimming in the ocean here in Santa Cruz, the coldest time of the year is actually, or when the water is the coldest, is usually in spring and, part of the summer when you have very strong upwelling or very strong supply of those deep waters because of the wind patterns that we have along the California coast. And so that's the best example of how upwelling affects us if we try to go swimming in the spring, but how much of the food web really enjoys this time of year.
Yeah, and where did you say upwelling was occurring? Did you say that it was just happening here on the West Coast?
No, it actually happens in many places of the ocean. It happens along the equator in the Pacific Ocean. It happens, but it primarily happens in 4 different regions that are on the eastern side of the major ocean basins. And, if you live here in California or on the West Coast, you've certainly noticed that starting in spring, in April or May, we have some really strong winds blowing from the north usually, or the northwest. And there's a really funny thing in the ocean is because the earth is rotating, when the wind blows over the surface of the ocean, the water doesn't move in the direction of the wind, but it moves perpendicular to the wind. So in the northern hemisphere here, where we are in California, if the wind blows from the north, it's actually pushing the water at the surface of the ocean away from the coast. And that water has to be replaced. We can't just move water away from the coast, otherwise there'd be no more water at the beach, which would be sad. So the water gets replaced by deep water that comes in right at the coast to replace that water that's moving offshore, pushed by the wind. And this is what the basic process of upwelling. And in the world's ocean, there's 4 regions that are famously known as upwelling region, which is the California current. So it's the waters off the west coast of the United States. There is the Benguela current off of South Africa. There's the Humboldt current off of Peru and Chile in South America. And the Canary current, which is off the northwest African coast. And those regions are rather small in terms of the surface area that they represent in terms of the entire ocean, maybe 1 or 2%. But they probably support about 20% of the global fish catch. So those upwelling regions are very important from a fisheries and marine ecosystem point of view, even though if you look at a map, it's a pretty small area of the ocean.
Right. So that's really cool that we just in our own backyards is that we're seeing this upwelling process take place. And I have to say, it's like one out of the four regions in the world, and it's just happening off the West Coast here and kind of right off, in our backyards in Santa Cruz, California. That is pretty awesome.
It's quite an
So,
exciting place, and that's why, we have all those marine mammals and seabirds and whales coming through in the summer to exploit or feed on the food web that's generated by the upwelling.
yeah, definitely. And I was just about to ask too about how this affects the entire ecosystem. So we have this upwelling process take place, and we just have all of these animals from tiny organisms, big predators come in to take advantage of this really, really cool food source. So what have you been seeing in your work and how this process affects the ecosystem?
Well, first, as you mentioned, it's a process that starts with the phytoplankton, or what we call the primary production. So it's tiny marine algae that will exploit those nutrients and do photosynthesis, and in turn, those phytoplankton get eaten by zooplankton, which is sort of little shrimp or microscopic shrimp, if you will. And then that's food for sardine and anchovy, and that's food for sea lion, and that's food for salmon, and that's food for whales. And when you think about the predators that we have in the system, there's actually a wide range of species. Some of them are what we call resident species, like sea lions or seabirds that live in the California current system most of the year and exploited. And then we have more migratory species like whales or albacores, for example, who time their arrival into the California current or off the west coast of the United States. So they reach the peak of the upwelling and when the food web is most available to them. And that explains why we get humpback and blue whales in the summer, but they don't live off the US West Coast the entire year. They just swim through in the spring and summer when the upwelling is maximum. But
Right.
what's also interesting is that the species that are resident to the California current, like sea lions, those species also have a life history that's very closely tied to the timing of upwelling. So for example, sea lions typically have their pup in spring because that's when the mother can go out and find a lot of fish and come back and feed the pups. So what we find, and that's part of the research that I do, is if you end up with a year where the winds would start a month later, and that has happened, for example, in 2005, then there is a mismatch between the life cycle of those predators or those marine organisms and their environment. So for example, in 2005, we observed there was a lot of starvation of the sea lion pups because the upwelling had not started and they were born and the mother were going out trying to find food and they just couldn't find the food. So for us, or at least for me, for the research I do, understanding how the upwelling changes from year to year in its timing and in intensity, and how that then translates to changes in the food web is just a really exciting topic of research, and really helps understand what we can expect from year to year, what are, I would say, natural changes in the environment in the food web. And this is sort of the starting point to understand how perhaps us as humans will influence this ecosystem in the long term through climate change. But it's really difficult to make a statement about human-induced climate change if you don't understand how naturally the system works and how much it changes from year to year, from decade to decade.
Yeah. And what really blows me away is how you figure all of this out. So I am really curious about your methods and what you do to learn about upwelling and how it's affecting the food web. So what does a typical research day look like for you? How are you learning all of this information?
Well, so in terms of a research day, it's not super exciting because I spend most of my day in front of my computer. So I do computer modeling of marine ecosystems. So I'm probably going to be dating myself if I use SimCity as an example of what I do. But essentially, we derive mathematical equations that represents the best we can certain processes in the ocean, whether that's the movement of ocean currents or the temperature of the ocean or how quickly a phytoplankton can grow if it has lights and nutrients or how quickly that phytoplankton gets eaten. And we try to come up with equations, mathematical equation that describes this, and then we code them and put it in a program that we can then run to simulate what marine food webs look like in any part of the ocean. So that's probably half of my morning. I do some coding and try to improve on those equations, and then I run the model, and that's usually about 2 to 3 weeks. Those are rather large computer programs that we run on supercomputers, which is just a whole bunch of computers hooked up together. And then this is where the interesting work begins, because when you run a computer model that describes a marine food web, you have to make sure that your model is grounded and that it actually reproduces the food web you're trying to model. So we rely a lot on people that go out on ships and do observations, and you probably had a few of those scientists on this Labside Chat. And we do the best we can to match the model results with observations of temperature or chlorophyll, which represent sort of phytoplankton, if you will. Or observations of seabirds or marine mammals. And then once we're happy with the results that the model can produce, then this opens the door for a lot of very exciting research, in the sense that when you run a model, you know everything about everything everywhere all the time. Whereas you go on a boat and do measurements, it's whatever you see that particular day. And you have no guarantee that if you went back on the boat the next day, you would observe the exact same thing. So observations are very critical to make sure the models are as correct as we want them to be, or as we would like them to be. And then models in turn can be really useful to put observation in a broader context, because then you can interrogate the model and say, well, if you saw this today, how different would it look tomorrow? How would it look different today, but 20 kilometers away? So, this is where the power of modeling comes in. And obviously, oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, I think that's so important to note, because it just goes to show that you can learn so many new and interesting things about the ocean that involve so many different disciplines too, right? So it's very math heavy, computer science, software, and modeling is just so incredibly important. And I just think that's really, really neat in ocean sciences, how diverse it could be.
Yeah, and that's what makes my work exciting, is because I have mathematical equation for ocean currents, for phytoplankton, for sea lions, and I try to put them all together and make sense of it. And so when you do modeling, you always start by trying to reproduce the past, because your model doesn't really have a value if you cannot reproduce events that have happened to the past and that have significantly affected the marine environment or the food web. But if you can do this, then it also opens the door to look at what might happen in the future. As you know, it's extremely hard to collect observations in the future. But with the model, it's like doing weather forecasts that you might be more used to if you look on TV to tell you if it's going to be raining or windy tomorrow in 3 days. So we can do similar type of calculation with the model, and this is what we refer to as climate projections. Mm-hmm. And it'll tell us how the food web may evolve in the next 10, 20, 50 or 100 years. And without models, that would be impossible to do.
Right, and I'm really glad that you're talking about future predictions, because we received a couple questions from Anna as well as Adrian asking about climate change and what your thoughts are on what's going to happen in the future. So specifically, there was also I believe a paper, an article that recently came out talking about how juvenile white sharks are hanging out in the Monterey Bay region due to warmer waters. And so that could be a potential concern of how that affects the ecosystem. So how are you seeing climate change play into your work? That's a heavy question. I know. If you get let's try to summarize it in 2 minutes. It's going to be hard.
It's a very loaded question. What I can say is that we need to understand the past very well before we can make definite statement about the future. What we also need to do when we look at climate change with models is also spend time understanding how certain we are of the projection from the model. So for me, it's something that I've been thinking a lot about and spending some time researching is how can we best characterize the uncertainty that come with the prediction. And again, if I can use the analogy of weather forecasting again, you look at the weather forecast, they tell you there's a 20% chance of rain tomorrow. So you might not care. You probably won't take an umbrella. There's an 80% chance of rain. You'll start packing your rain gear. So essentially, we would like to be able to do the same thing with projections about the future evolution of marine food webs. Is say, knowing what we know about the system and how it naturally varies, and knowing about the expected change, say, related to human activities, how can we reconcile the two and say, well, there is maybe a 50% chance of great white shark in Monterey Bay, and is that due to just normal year-to-year changes in what great white sharks like to do, or are we seeing, year after year and decade after decade, more great white shark hanging out in Aptos? And this would be your sign that climate change is starting to influence the system. So this is something that's very important to understand, is the ocean naturally varies on timescales of years to decades to century, and that has, we have no bearing on that change. So it's hard to say, for 5 years in a row, if you get great white sharks hanging out in Aptos, that this is due to climate change. It's really to make the connection to climate change. This has to happen year after year after year after year over 20 years, so that you can see something that's very different than what you expect to happen naturally in the system. And that's our biggest challenge, is because to make that distinction between what happens naturally and what has changed over time, you need a very long time series. You need 50 years, 100 years of observation of the ocean or those species to start making that distinction.
Awesome. So we only have a few minutes left, and we have a couple questions to ask. And so we got a really great question, I think, again, from Anna, asking about your past and if you always wanted to be a scientist. And so did you know that you always wanted to work at a university and do this type of research? Or was there a moment in your career that was like, nope, changing paths?
I was always interested in the sciences, and I was always interested in computer modeling. Ocean sciences for me came a little bit later. So I did my undergraduate in Switzerland. For those who are familiar with the map of Europe, we don't have a whole lot of coastlines and oceans in Switzerland. So I started, I wanted to be an aerospace engineer, and I realized then that was not really what I wanted to do. And I worked as a biomedical engineer for a while, and that's not what I wanted to do. And then I started diving, and I had the opportunity to dive in the Red Sea in Egypt, and so amazing coral reefs, and then dove in a bunch of places and realized that this is what I cared the most about. I wanted to know about marine ecosystems and research that, and that's when I decided to go to the University of Miami to get a PhD in marine science. So through diving, the short answer is.
Diving was the spark. That's great. And so we got a question from Jacob asking, what type of advice do you have for any aspiring scientists out there?
Those are hard questions to understand, but just be as open-minded as you can and learn as much as you can about different sciences or science disciplines. Learn about the physics, learn about the biology, learn about the chemistry, because at least for me, what makes marine science exciting is that it's a discipline where you can be very interdisciplinary and talk about how the physics affects the biology and the chemistry and the food web. And, you know, that opens so many doors of talking with other scientists and collaborating with other scientists. And then every day you learn something that you didn't know about the biology, you learn something you didn't know about the physics, you learn something you didn't know about why sea lions go forage one place or another. So, you know, it's just learning about the sciences in general, knowing the math, and then after that is, you know, whether you want to be on the boat, whether you want to drive an underwater vehicle that collects observation, whether you want to do what I do, which is computer coding to model the ocean and marine food web. So I don't think there is an exact answer to this question, but it's just to be, you know, let the ocean amaze you and learn about it.
I think that's great advice, you know, being open-minded, willing to absorb information, and just always being inspired from the ocean. I think that's great advice. So, all right, Jerome, I have one question left for you that I ask every single scientist on this program, and it is, what is the absolute best part of your job? Thing you love the most? Could be anything too. It could be teaching students, to diving, to anything.
Well, I would say diving, but it's not quite part of my job anymore. I used to do a lot more diving for my research, but I don't. For me, what the best part of my job is the community. It's the community of scientists, it's the community of students, it's the community of postdoc. And for me, being in that position where I get to interact with scientists or marine scientists in all disciplines on a regular basis and just get a little bit of a glimpse on how marine food web work and what may affect them in the future is, you know, it's why I get up and sometimes, you know, stare at the window and say, this is pretty cool, and I'm excited to do what I do.
Yeah, definitely. The community is a huge driver. I would say it's a great community to be a part of. So, well, Jerome,
certainly thank you. To your point, also feeding back to the community, and you know, my wife is a middle school teacher, so whenever I have a chance, I go and give a presentation to their kid about observing the oceans and ocean ecosystems, and I think this is equally an important part of what we do as scientists and researchers, to, as best we can, try to communicate what we do to the general public, and especially, you know, education at all levels, because eventually, you know, the kids that are in school now will be taking over for us and be left with much bigger problems than we have now.
Yeah, definitely inspiring and teaching the next generation is so incredibly important. Well, Jerome, thank you again so much for being here. We are somehow out of time already. It flew by, but it's just so interesting to hear about your work and what you do and all of the modeling and the coding that goes into it, just to learn all of these really interesting processes in the ocean. So thank you so much for sharing your time and energy with us today. And for folks watching at home, they're probably as interested in this topic as I am. So do you have a website or a place online that folks can go to learn more about you and your research?
I have to admit, I'm lacking a little bit in the social media department. I don't have Instagram, I don't have Twitter, but if you Google my name and UCSC, it'll take you to hopefully a couple of websites. One is my faculty webpage at UCSC that should have more information, but has a little bit of information. And then there was a feature article by the Institute of Marine Science, I believe 2 or 3 years ago. So you should be able to find that. But if anything, you should be able to find my email. And if you have any questions, just don't hesitate to reach out. I don't always answer, within a day, but I try to answer all the emails I get. So don't, hesitate to ask. And thanks again for inviting me. I was very glad to be part of this and do a Labside chat.
Of course, of course. Well, all of those links that you mentioned, I actually just dropped them into the YouTube live chat feature, so folks can find them there. They'll also be added to the video description after we wrap up this Labside chat here. So again, links are in the YouTube live chat. Go ahead and explore away. But before we wrap up, I also want to say a few quick things about the Seymour Center, some upcoming events we have planned. From February 21st through the 27th, the Seymour Center is hosting Elephant Seal Celebration Week, where we are highlighting elephant seal science at UC Santa Cruz all week long. So please join us for that week. There's live events you can participate in. I just dropped the link in the YouTube live chat, so you can go ahead and explore there after you're done exploring Jerome's profiles and web pages. And last but certainly not least, thank you to everyone watching today. It's really folks like you that make these online programs possible. And if you're in the position, I ask that you please consider either making a donation or becoming a member with the Seymour Center. You can find more information on our website, which is seymourcenter.ucsc.edu, or you can click on the links in the video description below. But with that, we want to thank everyone for tuning in, and we will see you next time. So take care, everyone, and goodbye.